Good evening all and welcome. Before the video begins, I would just like to give a huge thank you to everyone who has contributed to the app campaign. We're nearly 25% of the way there. I can't thank you all enough for your generosity. For those of you who may have missed it, we're running an ad campaign for the new Mortis Media app. Every story ever told on the app. That's over 2,500 for your listening pleasure. You can find out more by following the link in the description. And of course, a huge thank you also to my good friend Papa Scare for joining us in tonight's video. He is an exceptionally talented narrator, and you'll find that out now shortly. If you enjoy his content, there will be a link in the description and at the end of the video for you to click on so you can see more from him. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. Like most millennials, I have to work multiple jobs to make money, and one of these jobs is driving for Lyft. Last night, a very friendly and pleasant passenger forgot her phone in my car. I didn't discover that until the morning when she sent a notification through Lyft. Since I had other work to do, I didn't get to returning the phone until early this afternoon. By then, my passenger had given me her address, so I drove to her apartment to return the phone. Now, this apartment has a very narrow one-way road running in front of it, but it was empty since it was the middle of the day, so I parked my car on the road with the hazard lights on to return the phone. It took me a few minutes at most to figure out where to leave the phone, and once I left the phone somewhere safe, I saw a lady in a red car pull up behind me and ran down the stairs to go grab my car. She rolled down the window and asked if I was looking for someone. I told her I had found who I was looking for, jumped back into my car while she was still speaking, and drove out of her way and out of the apartment complex. That should have been the end of it. I decided to drive to Starbucks since I was hungry and going through caffeine withdrawals, so I stayed on the main road and headed that way. That's when I noticed something peculiar. The lady was following right behind me, but since that road leads to practically everything else in my city, I didn't think anything of it, until I signaled to turn left to go to a shopping area and noticed that she was still behind me. Growing suspicious, after I made my left turn, I turned suddenly into a road that led into a bank and other small businesses, not realizing it was one way. When I reached the dead end, I turned around and headed back to the main road, only to realize this lady was still stalking me. In panic, I reached the main road, turned into another parking lot, and cut through to a local movie theater, and kept driving until I was sure I had lost her. When I noticed the lady wasn't following me anymore, I drove to Starbucks, got my food and drink, and returned home, played some video games and other stuff, and ran upstairs to tell my story on Reddit, only to discover that Lyft had emailed me, issuing a deactivation warning for unsafe driving. Of course, I can't say with certainty, but given what I've just said, I think it was the stalker that reported me.
I stopped taking the taxi about a year ago. I was 23 at the time and working as a community nurse. It was during the Christmas season and my co-workers kept on pestering me to attend one of the yearly parties at the time. I can't say I was particularly excited. I've never really enjoyed heading out to bars, especially since I've always lived so far away, and getting home was always a stressful experience. But my partner at the time lived in the neighboring city, and he encouraged me to give it a go. Getting to know my co-workers outside of a hectic day in the healthcare system was certainly tempting. He finalized my decision by telling me he'd pay for the taxi to get home. I insisted he shouldn't, but I appreciated it. So that day I got the heels on, attended the party and had a good time. After staying at the locale we rented, my co-workers asked if I wanted to join them at a bar. I was hesitant but confident that I would get home safe. Safety has always been a really important thing for me, and I've always been taught to take care of myself and to make reasonable decisions. At the end of the night, I've had some drinks. I'm not intoxicated, but I've enjoyed the night with my co-workers. One of my co-workers suggests heading to her place for the night, and to try and build a relation, I decide to go. We take a taxi and everything is fine. When I arrive at my co-worker's place, however, I rethink my decision. It wasn't anything particularly wrong. I just kind of figured it would be nice to head home to my partner, so I wouldn't have to think about the travel the next day. So I tell her she won't need to stress about setting up a room for me and everything. I head back out again and call some random taxi company. I wait for a bit before I notice a taxi driving up to the sidewalk. I make the terrible decision to sit in the front seat. The man appears to not be from Norway. He's got stubble, dark hair and dark skin. I remember he spoke with a heavy accent. The conversation starts normal. He asks where I've been and if I've enjoyed myself. After a moment, he asks me if I'm Norwegian. I've got brown eyes, dark hair and slightly tan skin. It wasn't hard to figure, so I said no. But I was raised in Norway and considered myself a Norwegian. It was after that the conversation started turning darker. He began talking about the Norwegian drinking culture and how women behaved recklessly. He began referring to women as whores and how they would carelessly have sex with men regardless of their marriage and dignity. I kind of went along with the conversation. Insulting the guy was the last thing I wanted to do. A terrifying feeling of control overwhelmed me. While I wasn't intoxicated, I really didn't want him to have any suspicion that I wasn't in control of the situation. The longer the car ride continued, the more personal it got. Where are you going? To my partner. How long have you two been together? About a year. Do you have sex often? The question caught me off guard and I kind of shrugged it off. I mumbled, I don't really talk about that. And a mild silence overwhelmed the car. The traffic light turned red at some point during the ride, and he asked me to turn to him and come a little closer. I'm not really sure what you do at that point, but I turned to him, in which he looked into my eyes and told me that I had beautiful eyes. It was at this point that the alarms completely went off, and I was completely convinced that I was in danger. That was the moment when I slowly began to undo my heels while the car was still in motion. I was ready to jump out of the car if I had to. It's only when I start recognizing the streets that I managed to calm myself down, that he was at the very least taking me to my destination. When he finally pulls up to my partner's driveway is when I quickly pay. My heels are already in my hand, and he doesn't get a second to finish his sentence before I bolt out of the car, barefoot, and into the house frantically. My partner wakes up and asks me what happened. The next day I spend an entire day contemplating if I should call the taxi company and complain. I question myself repeatedly, but then I remember that he called me at some point in the night to ask for my specific location, and the fear of him connecting the dots that it was me that complained about him catches me. I really regret that I never called in. I remember vividly looking down at my skirt, my heels and my top when he was talking about women in such a degrading way, and for a moment I almost convinced myself that I was precisely what he was talking about. I wonder what would have happened if I had been more intoxicated, if I had less control of the situation, or if I wasn't heading to my partner. A lot could have gone wrong that night. I vividly remember reading in the newspaper 3 weeks later that there had been a taxi incident where a woman had been assaulted by a taxi driver. A month prior, my friend had nearly been dragged into the taxi because the taxi driver was begging her to have sex with him. All I'm saying is, stay safe out there, girls. Always have a plan to get home.
It was a sunny, warm day when I visited my aunt, who lives near downtown of my city as I live on the outskirts. At around 4 p.m. I decided to return home, so I called the taxi as usual, because getting to my place using public transport is very time-consuming. So I go inside the taxi and this guy is just giving me a bad vibe. Something about him is off. I tell him the address and hope he won't be talking to me, but I'm wrong. He starts with comments like, "Why do chicks live so far away from the city?" Or, "Why are you in the back seat instead of the front?" And every time we stop, he looks at my skirt, which pulls up slightly while I'm sitting. Then some friend of his calls him on the phone and it's connected to speaker, so I hear their conversation. The driver tells his friend that he has a great girl in his car and she looks like she wants some fun. You know what kind. And as he says these things, he's looking at me in the mirror. Yeah, at this point I'm trying to ignore all that he's saying because it's making me really anxious. After he hangs up, he stops the car at a bus stop, which is very illegal, and asks me if I can pay in cash. I said yes, and to that he responds, "Can you pay me by sleeping with me?" This just infuriated me, and I told him to take me home now or that I was going to call the company and give them his taxi number and description of the harassment and breaking the law. He looked at me in a face of defiance, so I began dialing the number, and I guess he got scared and started driving again, as he didn't say a word until the end of the ride. I told him to stop next to a slightly different address, which wouldn't make him suspicious because where I live, the addresses are quite messed up, so it's easy to get lost. When I get out, I pretended to be searching my bag for keys, just to make sure he drove away. When he did, he stopped about 50 meters away from me and looked at me. I was standing there until I was sure he was gone for good, and I wasn't followed, and then went home. So although nothing creepy actually happened, it's always better to stay safe than sorry. Maybe it was a weird vibe from him. Maybe I felt scared because I was trapped in a car with him and his behavior caught me off guard. In either case, I wish I'd never meet him again. I actually did end up calling the taxi company and they apologized and said they'd look into it. I hope he was sacked. Filthy pervert.
So a bit of background. I'm from a Caribbean country and all high schools here have a specific uniform to wear. I went to prestigious all-girls Catholic school and our uniform made us look like we were little girls. My school was 15 to 20 minutes away from where I lived. So I travelled with taxis to and fro. Taxi drivers would normally drop me in front of the school on mornings, but when the school finished at 2:30 p.m, I had to walk 7 to 10 minutes to reach the taxi stand to go back home. Sometimes I would be there standing till 4:30 to 5 p.m. waiting. Right, so on to the story. When I was 16 in 5th form, I'd already been travelling for the past couple of years. After my initial hired driver quit after the first 3 years, there was a particular taxi driver who was in his mid to late 20s. I took his taxi a few times, no problem. There was always other people in it, and he was always friendly and laughing with everyone. One particular evening, I got into his car and realized I was the only passenger in it. There were others outside, waiting to get a taxi going in my same direction, yet he passed them straight. I thought it was strange, but didn't bother too much about it, until he began asking me personal questions about my family and myself, and kept asking if I had a boyfriend. He then proceeded to tell me how I looked sexy walking down the street to the taxi stand, and how he always looked at me after school. He also said he waited for me and saved a seat in his car for me every day. He even went on to tell me the kinds of sexual stuff he would do to me if he was my boyfriend. He went on like this for the entire ride, and I felt extremely uncomfortable. A couple of times, when the fear rose in me, I thought of just jumping out of the car and running away. Thankfully, he dropped me home safely, yet hinted that he couldn't wait for the next time I got into his car. The following days, I refused to take his taxi, and this apparently infuriated him. He would drive up to me while I was waiting by the taxi stand, then rev his car and speed off. then turn back and roll his windows down and stare at me with rage. This went on for a while, until a day my dad was with me at the taxi stand and noticed how the guy was acting and asked me why I didn't want to get into the car. I ended up telling him and my mum later on. They were obviously panicked, and for my A-level years, they didn't make me travel.
I'm a 26-year-old female living in a big city. I work every day, even during the pandemic, and take public transportation to work, so I've dealt with my fair share of men aggressively trying to talk to me, or even sometimes look for a fight. I put a deposit down on my own apartment, so I was across the city dropping my deposit off. It started pouring, so instead of making the arduous journey home on the bus, one transfer and lots of walking, and I didn't have a raincoat, I decided to call a Lyft. My driver gets there, pulls up, and is motioning for me to get in. I notice he isn't wearing a face mask, so when he rolls the window down, I say, "Oh, hi, I'll just wait for you to put your mask on." He then comes out with, "What the hell does it look like in my hand?" I was a bit taken aback. "Oh, I'm just waiting for both of us." He hesitated a second, then gave me an angry scowl. I don't think I've ever experienced anything like this from a stranger, just pure anger, like if I were in front of him, he would have murdered me. I swear it was that intense. He then said, "Do you think I need you to tell me to put it on?" No, I'm just waiting," I reply. He then gave me a look again and sped off, not before calling me a very few choice swear words. Of course, I reported him to Lyft, but the best part of the story is the strangers that backed me up. One woman said that she saw what was going on and that it was messed up, and the two older men who waited with me while I cried for my next ride provided words of comfort. Not everyone's that bad, but the crappy ones are truly the worst. My mum brought up an interesting point, as that since I probably got this guy fired, he's going to have even more violent rage. I certainly hope he didn't get my name and address from Lyft.
I had just graduated from college and was a thin, buxom blonde SoCal girl. I was traveling alone and had a one-night layover at a hotel in Salt Lake City, Utah, on my way to Atlanta the next day. It was the first time I was staying at a hotel by myself, and although I was a little nervous, I was feeling grown up, independent, and ready for my adventure. This was long before the days of Uber or Lyft and cell phones. I hailed a taxi from the queue outside the airport terminal and felt relieved and comfortable when the driver was a woman. Those feelings disappeared quickly once she exited the main road and took me to the wrong side of town. I was nervous and didn't say anything, thinking perhaps she was picking up another passenger. I didn't have many experiences with taxis, living in South California. She pulled over and a man approached her driver's side window. They spoke for several minutes, while frequently glancing at me sitting in the back seat. I could not hear what they were discussing because they spoke quietly, and there was a partition between the front and back seat of the taxi. Both the driver and this unknown man looked very suspicious. As I mentioned, I did not have a cell phone, and no one knew where I was. I hadn't been to the hotel yet to call home to let them know I had arrived safely. Also, I had never been to Salt Lake City before, and this was not a part of town tourists would visit, even if I had. I became keenly aware that I could vanish, and no one would know what happened to me or where to look. I also wasn't sure if this was a drug deal, but I'm confident they were discussing something illegal. I tried to remain calm, but did not want to anger anyone. After what seemed to be an eternity, I asked to be taken to the hotel since someone was waiting for me there and I was late, which was a lie, obviously. They ended the conversation and the driver and I did not speak for the rest of the trip. I could not think of a way to get her ID or the license plate info without arousing suspicion or making her angry, since She knew where I was staying and I was arriving alone. I was young, naive and frightened. Perhaps she was just trying to run up the meter and overcharge me for the fare. But I think my guardian angel was looking out for me that day. I'm a strong proponent of trusting your instincts. All these many years later, it still gives me chills when I think about it. I can't help but feel there had been an evil plot from which I was spared. My heart breaks for those who have not been as fortunate and their families struggling for answers.
I work odd hours. Sometimes I'm coming into work at 5 a.m., sometimes I'm leaving at 5 a.m. Most of my shifts are nights, but I have two 12-hour day shifts. Side note, I was 41 at this point, female, rather heavy-set, and somewhat plain and dressed in my work uniform. Blue security shirt and navy cargo pants, not exactly the definition of alluring. One morning, I was early, so I stopped at the Tim Hortons near my workplace, which is an area that gets a lot of young university students, tech workers, and industrial workers. I went in, ordered, paid, and left. I had been the only person in the lot when I entered the store, and had been the only customer in the store. It was very early, and still dark out. When I came out with my coffee and muffin, I noticed one of the ubiquitous Waterloo taxi cabs parked right next to my old car, a dark grey sedan with the logos of the local taxi company emblazoned on its side and rear. The entire lot was empty, but this twit parked right beside the driver's side of my car. Instantly, my nerves were on edge. The man in the car, I'd say, was at least in his 50s, somewhat heavy-set and looked a little foreign. He was staring at me in a way that just screamed creepy, not even looking away when I skewed him with my glare. Most starers will at least turn their gaze away momentarily when caught being creepy, but this guy was just so blatant about his staring he didn't turn away. His stare turned into an outright glare, so I began to get worried that he was more than just a jerk. I said to myself, screw dignity, and got in on the other passenger's side, climbed into the driver's seat from there, which is no easy feat as I'm larger than the average person and with a physical disability. And as soon as I got into the driver's seat, he started his car and began to circle mine very close. Around and around he goes, glaring at me the whole time. I had no idea what his problem was, but then I remember that there had been some pretty major disputes in Kitchener/Waterloo between cabbies and Uber drivers, with some Uber drivers being followed and harassed by cabbies in the recent weeks. It had even made the local news a few times. Maybe the guy thought I was an Uber. That didn't make sense to me though, as I was driving a 17-year-old Subaru that had more rust than paint at that point. No way an Uber would send a car like mine to pick up a customer. As the guy circled me, I thought, maybe I should just leave and head to work even though I'm early. So I put the old beast into drive and waited for the creepy cabbie to drive behind me and just floored it the hell out of there. Of course, he followed. At that point I figured heading into work would be a very bad idea. As my coworker left, I'd be there alone for 12 hours, and our office, the whole building really, is a giant fishbowl. All windows, zero privacy. It may be swipe card access only, but if someone was really intending to get in there, all he'd have to do was grab a rock and smash one of those big old floor-to-ceiling windows. So I started making random turns. He followed. I zipped through a red light by going through a corner lot gas station and he followed. I raced through the lots of empty factories near my workplace and he followed. By this time, it was growing short on time. The roads were nearly empty, so I couldn't use traffic to get free of him, and I had no choice but to head back towards work. At the time, my building was very big and had enormous lots around it. I pulled into the entrance furthest from where we security guards parked, and the twit followed. But he only got about 8 meters in before he stopped. I continued in towards the parking and the office door. When I parked, he was still sitting in the lot. I jumped out the car, grabbed my bag, locked the old beast and ran into the security office. My coworker Rob asked if I was okay, as I must have looked as freaked out as I felt. I told him the saga, and he put the lot's camera feed into the monitoring screen so we could see the guy in the lot. he was still there. Rob went outside, and as soon as the cabbie saw Rob, he turned around and booked it. I asked Rob if he'd stay an extra half hour or so in case he returned. Rob's bus didn't come for 45 minutes, so he stayed. We'd gotten the cabbie's license plates and his individual ID number since he'd been circling, and I talked about what to do. I had come to the conclusion that I would call the cab company and complain, but when Rob finally left, I hadn't yet, and after 10 minutes he texted me. He sent a picture of the cab, which he said was parked in the lot of the gas station not even a block away. I called the police. The cab was long gone when the young constable got there 15 minutes later, and I told him what happened and gave him the plate and cabbie IDs. I did call the cab company too. I got a manager who was clueless, unhelpful, and obviously covering for his driver, and he said he had no cabs with that plate and no cabbies with that ID. All delivered in an accent so thick it was nearly unintelligible. Meanwhile, a few days later, the police called back and said they had paid a visit to the cab company's office, where they had delivered a very stern warning to the manager. I never saw that particular cab again, but as cabbies can switch the cars they're driving at ease, and taking their IDs off one car and putting it onto another, I assume the jerk is still out there creeping on single women in parking lots. I don't give a damn about the dispute between cabbies and Ubers. As I see it, the cab companies want business and they need to step up their game and maybe even clean up their cars and bathe their employees, and not hire creeps. But still, I wonder if I ended up being mistaken for an Uber driver, and that's why he creeped on me and followed me. Anyway, it's not like it was the right thing to do. So creepy cab driver, let's never meet again.
Background. I'm a medical student and I live just behind my college, in a hostel in a well-populated area. It takes about 15 minutes to get to my college from my hostel. So this happened a year ago. I had just enrolled into college. And you know the enthusiasm when you just enter the college. All the ambitions to do good, to come out on top of the class. I hadn't studied for about a week, so I decided I needed to do something about it. I decided to study from that very day. It was about 10:45 p.m. in the evening, but I would not budge. I was determined to study, and what better place than the college library? So I packed some books and headed off to the library, a 15-minute walk around the walls of my college. It was about 11 when I got out of my hostel and through a small corridor made my way to the main road. Though it was well lit, it was eerily silent and lonely. I had never been here at this time of the night. Then, from the corner of my eye, I noticed a vehicle approaching me from behind. I didn't care much as it drove past me, but then it stopped 10 meters ahead of me. As I walked by, the driver rolled the window down and spoke to me in our native language. "Hello, sir. You're going to the hospital, aren't you? I know you. You study doctor, don't you?" I was taken aback. I glanced at his face and no, I didn't know him by any means. And I had not been there long enough and hadn't interacted with many people for someone to know me. He again said, "Don't worry, sir. I will take you there for free. Come, sit here. I'm going to the same place." He pointed at his back seat. He again made the same request, emphasizing on the free ride. I couldn't process all of it, but my instinct told me that something was wrong. Why would someone I don't know offer me a free ride to a place not even far away at this time of the night? To add to that, the neighborhood a few blocks away was notorious for its cases of looting of passerbys, and we were clearly warned by our seniors not to venture there in the dark, and to always have a companion, even while going to the library. I quickly said, "I'm not going there. You can carry on, sir," and started walking on. I was watching everything with the corner of my eye as I walked on. The taxi didn't move an inch, and then I was struck with a dilemma. The path divided into a straight road that led to my college, and one acute U-turn that went down the hill. I had to make a choice. If I go the straight way, he would have an excuse to question me again, as I had lied. So I made a split-second decision and went down the dark U-turn and ducked down in the shadows and watched. My heart was about to explode. The taxi started off and accelerated towards the straight path for some reason. I ran back to the original path and again hid in the shadows of a corridor and watched. The taxi went straight, entered a wide area, and came round and went down the hill the same way where I had been a few moments earlier, ducking in the dark. I completely froze. He had clearly stated where he was headed to, but immediately changed his route to where I pretended to go. I ran back to my hostel, locked my room and tried to calm down and gather my thoughts. It costs an awful lot to study MBBS in our place, so you need a good family income to sustain. And every other person in the area was a medical student staying in a hostel. So maybe his intention was to rob me, or worse, kidnap me, pretending he knew me, or maybe he just really did want to help. I don't know, and I will never find out. But after that, I have never walked alone at night in the area, and I also messed up my studies for the next month or so.
This was around 2017 in Casablanca. My cousins, friends and I were going to a restaurant at night. We were 5 people, so we had to take 2 cabs. My cousin, our friend and I took the first taxi. We were minors at the time, and it was my first time taking a taxi without an adult. The driver seemed a bit weird at first. His eyes were reddish, and he looked like he was on something. We could just tell by the way he was speaking. He started driving and was making inappropriate comments. I can't remember specifically because it was a while ago, but it certainly made us all uncomfortable. We were at a stoplight and he suddenly locked the doors and said, "I'll choose one of you lot and I'll take her back with me." He then looked at my cousin who was next to him and then looked at us in the back and said, "I'll take her," while pointing at my cousin and smiling. At that point I felt my blood pressure drop. And the thing is, none of us had cell phone credit or data. He just started asking questions and somehow talked about football, and my cousin tried to engage conversation with him to lighten the atmosphere. He started telling us that he was a football coach for girls, and started saying stuff about the girls and showing us their pictures. I was looking around, and I saw he was taking the right route, and we were near the restaurant. We asked him to stop, but he blanked us, so we repeated it, and he was like, "Chill girls, I'm gonna stop." And I was joking earlier. We got off and were shocked and relieved at the same time that nothing happened. But now I have this fear of taking a taxi by myself without an adult.
I'll never forget that night. It was last year and I had just turned 25. I had been to a friend's wedding in another state and was returning by train. I reached the station around 5 a.m. It was freezing as the temperature had hit 4 degrees. All I could think of was getting home fast, so I could sleep for hours after being tired from so many nights. I generally avoid traveling alone in the dark, but it was impossible to wait at the station till sunrise, because 1 hour seemed like a very long time. So I decided to get a taxi. The distance from the station to my apartment is roughly 40 kilometers. There were 2 taxis and I got into one of them without making any eye contact with the driver. I told him where I wanted to go and we started. This man must have been in his late 50s or early 60s. Silver grey hair, big build. I decided to go with this taxi because I thought I'd be more safe with this fellow since he was elderly. It was a mistake. Nearly 15 to 20 minutes had passed. I was looking at the road ahead, and there were very few cars. All I could see were trees that were close by. Fog covered everything else. Suddenly I noticed that this guy had been staring at me from the rearview mirror and didn't blink or look away when I looked at him. It had been over 2 minutes, and he was still staring. He had scary, droopy eyes. I was very uncomfortable at this point, so I used my scarf to cover half my face, which was only covering my neck all this time. This didn't stop him, and he suddenly started laughing like a maniac. Then he said a word in some other language, I believe, so I asked him to repeat. My heart was beating very fast. "So many people are dying," he said, and he started laughing again. I was too afraid to ask him any questions. I sat there, frozen, regretting why I didn't wait at the station. My hands were shivering because I was trying to send a message to a friend, but my fingers just couldn't type properly. He turned around now, facing me, asked me if I was married. I managed to speak nervously. "No." And he said, "You will repent." With those words, he started to speed up. My mind was going crazy now. What did he mean by that? Why would he say such a thing to me? I tried looking around to see if it was a good idea to get off that taxi, but it was still very dark and there weren't many cars around. Maybe 2 or 3 cars would pass us every 5 to 10 minutes. By this point, I was pretty convinced that he was taking me to some other place. Maybe he wasn't, but I was too terrified to think straight. I was trembling with fear, and I was sure he was going to attack me or do something worse. Suddenly, he slowed down and seemed to be talking to himself. "People die. You'll die. She'll die," pointing to the empty seat. With those words, he stopped the taxi right there and asked me to get out, saying, "We need fresh air and the petrol is over." He wasn't drunk, but he had been hallucinating, since he kept blabbering, looking at the empty seat, and was laughing for no reason. Arguing with him could make him annoyed, so I decided to do as he said until I got some help, or maybe I could stop him in some way by agreeing to all his demands. I got out of the taxi, and this guy got out too. Now, he was right in front of me, but at a car-length distance, holding a lit torch, pointing it on his neck and repeating, "You will repent." I was almost crying due to fear, but running was impossible because I could have been run over by some car due to the fog, and my mind was not working properly by this point. The thought of calling someone didn't occur to me earlier, and now was too risky since this maniac was standing right there, holding that torch and moving his head like some possessed person. It felt like a scene from a horror movie, and his eyes appeared bigger than normal due to the torchlight that illuminated his creepy, now serious face. He said something again which I didn't understand. I was sure he was going to kill me or torment me before that. I was extremely restless and looking around for help. To my relief, there was a car passing by and it stopped there looking at us, just standing in the middle of the road. The guy came running to me and asked me to go towards his car where his daughter, who was nearly my age, opened the door. The insane cab driver ran back to his taxi and drove off in seconds. Clearly, there was enough petrol. I was still breathing heavily and told them what had happened in the last 30 or 40 minutes. They told me I was in the opposite direction and it was not a safe area since many incidents with girls had happened there already. I was right. That driver was taking me to some other place. They had sensed something was wrong by the way that maniac stood there holding the torch, and that light showed my silhouette more clearly, so they decided to check what was going on. Had they not stopped, I wouldn't be alive to narrate this story. Ever since that night, I never travel alone at night. Never ever. I'm thankful to those people who saved my life. Sometimes we see many people who say they need help, but we fear it could be a trap, so we don't stop. Had they thought the same, I'd be dead.
A few years ago, I worked at a grocery store as the manager for the online shopping department. I didn't have a car at the time, so I would take Ubers to work occasionally. The night before this incident, I was at the local brewery with my friends. I took an Uber home, then thought the driver was kind of off because of how inquisitive he was, but played it off as him just making small talk. The next morning, I requested an Uber, and it was the same guy. No big deal. It happened all the time here because I lived in such a small town. So I got in the car and this guy remembered everything about me. But again, played it off because I'd literally seen him 12 hours before. I was definitely getting creeped out though. We started chatting again, and he was telling me about how he and his wife are having problems. I thought it was weird as hell, but figured maybe he just wanted to talk about it, because that's my personality. Then he started talking about how they used to ride four-wheelers together, and says how he misses it. I stupidly say, I've always wanted to ride one. Are they fun? Oh, they're great, he says. You should definitely ride some. I actually have a few. I got sketched out and was like, oh, cool. I should see if my boyfriend would be down to ride them too. Finally, we got to work. He gave me an awkwardly long goodbye speech and thanked me for using Uber. And about an hour later, my co-worker and I heard knocking at the door that leads to the pickup space. And it was the Uber driver. I awkwardly opened the door and my co-worker, that I call Steve, luckily came up behind me because I was like, what the hell? And the driver asked me to exchange numbers with him because he wanted to take me for a ride. Luckily, Steve was like, dude, I'm her boyfriend. What the hell, man? And we closed the door. Steve was an absolute champ. He didn't leave. We had to page my boss, and then he called the cops because he wouldn't go. And he ran off, finally, when the cops showed up. It was super creepy. I contacted Uber, got a refund, and also got a pretty strong confirmation that he no longer worked for them. Yikes. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I would like to extend a huge thank you to Papa Scare for joining me in tonight's video. It was an honor, my dude. It was so fun working with you. Thank you, as always. And if you liked his narrations, you should definitely check out his channel. He posts some awesome stuff, and I really enjoy it, so you guys probably will too. Again, huge thanks to everyone who's contributing to the app campaign. I am so excited. Really, really excited. Hopefully we can hit the target. We've still got 20 days to go, but I'm really pumped. Thank you everyone who's making this stream a reality. In other news, I'd like to give a huge thank you as well to all my members and patrons and coffee supporters whose names are on screen. You guys are just the best, so thank you. It really means the world to me. But yeah, check out Papa Scared. He has a link in the description and on screen now, so you can watch one of his videos, this one specifically. There you go. Give it a click. But if not, stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.